Good morning, everyone. Being the third speaker in a row in such a prestigious panel is a tough task, so I will try to keep it short and interesting as the previous speakers, but I don't promise you anything. Now, to be very honest with you, when I heard that I was supposed to talk a few minutes about what's cooking in the currently very eventful world of GIs, I got slightly nervous, because indeed there is a lot going on at the moment in the GI world. We already heard about the Lisbon revision process, which eventually will allow the EU to become a member to the Geneva Act, with the effect that all GIs registered under EU regulations could potentially be applied for a registration under the Geneva Act. And we have the initiative of the European Commission to introduce GI protection for non-agricultural goods. Now, if we take a look at who is playing the lead in this presentation, the GIs, then we see that on the one hand, during the last 2 decades, GI protection has experienced a growing legislative attention, while on the other hand, it still seems sometimes one of those areas where the interest of IP lawyers sometimes appears to exceed their practical experience. Kind of two worlds out there. There is the political world, and some have called the GIs actually the darling of the European Union. And then we have the world of the private practitioners dealing with day-to-day IP issues, where GIs do not get that much of excitement, except for the most famous ones like Champagne and Parmigiano Reggiano. And this despite the fact that GIs actually are a very powerful tool and a beautiful instrument to increase trade performance, what in the end of the day IP should do. So while others have called the GIs the darling of the European Union, to me it's more like the beautiful stranger of the IP world. A bit like in the soundtrack for this Austin Powers movie.
Yeah, baby!
Hello, Austin.
Hey, Basil, how are you?
We need your help. Someone is seducing our top agents. As you can see, she's a master of disguise. But Austin, whatever you do, don't fall in love. We've already lost 007 and 008.
Well then, Basil, this looks like a case for double... Oh, hey!
Haven't we met? You're some kind of beautiful stranger. You could be good for me.
And this is the modest goal of my presentation today, mainly to emphasize that GIs could be good for us 00 trademark agents, and hopefully it might positively contribute to such non-agricultural GIs not being such a stranger. So, on a more serious note now, more specifically, let's have a look at these incoming new GIs. As you may aware, under TRIPS obligations, GIs must be protected to at least ensure that the public is not misled and that unfair competition is prevented. For wines and spirits, there is an even broader protection provided for TRIPS, by TRIPS beyond the likelihood of confusion. Now, at EU level, we currently not have one, but we have 4 regulations dealing with the GI protection. We have the regulation on quality schemes for agricultural products and foodstuffs. We have a regulation dealing with wines, one on spirit drinks, and one on aromatized wine products, all providing for an even broader protection than established by TRIPS for wines and spirits. And for instance, Parmigiano Reggiano and Champagne are currently protected under these EU schemes. And for those who are staying in the Comforts Hotel, you might have noticed too that in the menu in the room, there is a quite unpleasant translation of Schaumweine, that is sparkling wine. However, having said this, we, however, do not have harmonization nor unitary EU rules to protect non-agricultural, industrial, and artisanal GIs. While the EU indeed is very rich in such products based on a traditional production method with a specific link to the area of origin, and you can see only a few examples here. So as a consequence, there is now a new scheme in the make with the aim of protecting traditional know-how and cultural heritage linked with a specific territory, which should remedy the insufficient protection. Because indeed, from the public consultation that the Commission had launched on a possible extension of GI protection to non-agricultural goods, it followed that the vast majority of stakeholders feel that there is indeed insufficient protection. We only have 50 member states now where there is legislation providing for protection for non-agricultural GIs. And that makes that producers must make separate applications where it is available and with differences from country to country. So they have to rely on a patchwork of IP tools. And this is, of course, not efficient in terms of functioning of the internal market. So the main trends triggering the most discussions were presented in January by the Commission and got published on the Commission's website last week. So it remains to be seen how the GI scheme will concretely be elaborated, but we already know that it will be open to GIs from third countries. And a question that will have to be considered is whether the new system will be exhaustive in nature. As following the Butt and Salame Filino cases or decisions of the ECG, it is indeed held that the foodstuffs, wines, and spirits regulations are to be considered exhaustive in nature. That is, superseding the national laws. While the ECJ has not specifically pronounced on the exhaustive nature of wines and spirits, it is held generally that the same principles should apply because the provisions are the same and the purpose are the same. And this is also specifically stated in the latest version of the OHIM guidelines. So ideally, of course, the new regulation should be clear on this point to avoid doubts and having to wait another decision by the ECJ. Of course, should the system be exhaustive in nature, then national laws will only be able to afford protection to geographical indications where there's no specific link with the territory, so the so-called single geographical indications or geographical indications of source. On the other hand, and this is not tackled by the ACJ yet, but it is to be assumed that, however, the national legislation will continue to be applied for members of the Lisbon Agreement to be able to comply with their obligations vis-à-vis third country GIs protected under the Lisbon Agreement. Other impacts on trademarks. Of course, the creation of a new GI scheme or a new category will increase the amount of GIs on which later trademark applications potentially could be refused. So it is even more important to extend trademark clearance searches to prior GIs. And also a new regulation will contain, we assume, very clear provisions on the relationship between trademarks and GIs, with a direct impact on OHIM and the national offices, because indeed the compromise text of the reform of the European trademark system now expressly addresses and streamlines the obligation of both national offices and OHIM to refuse ex officio trademark applications in violations of protected geographical indications. That is pursuant to national or union legislation or international agreements to which the union is party, providing for protection of geographical indications or designations of origin, which will also probably raise the awareness and sensibility of the offices in this regard. And a practical example, and this is actually an existing trademark in Italy, Murano a Porte, filed for glass products and jewelry made of glass in class 14 and 21, and the possible future GI for the famous vetro di Murano, the Murano glass. And what you see on the slide is actually the only trademark they have on EU level. There is no trademark on a national level. They only have this community, collective, figurative trademark. So should we apply the foodstuffs regulation provisions, then if this mark is applied for after the submission of the GI application, this mark or this application should be refused for products of the same type, ex officio. Is it applied for or acquired by use if the legislation provides for this possibility, or registered before the submission of this GI application, then under certain circumstances coexistence will be possible. Because indeed a prior trademark will only block a GI registration where the reputation, the renown and the length of time it has been used of the trademark would be liable would make that the later GI registration could be liable to mislead consumers as to the true identity of the product. And this will be a very rare case, because I'm only aware of the Bavaria case, where the Dutch brewer, holder of the Bavaria mark, tried to block the registration of the Bayerische Bier PGI, but the Commission held that the last condition, the liability to mislead consumers as to the true identity of the product, did not exist. With reference to the possibility of coexistence, very shortly, it's interesting to mention that TRIPS provides for some exceptions to member states related to GI protection, but only one of them is mandatory, and that's Article 24, Section 5, which establish, amongst others, that a prior trademark should be allowed to coexist if acquired in good faith and before GI protection before it was enjoying GI protection in the country of origin. So if we take this to our practical example, it's true that in Italy there is no legislation providing for GI protection for non-agricultural goods, but we have some court decisions upholding the protection as a GI of vetro di Murano. And the eldest decision I'm aware of is of the Court of Venice of November 2004. So applying the TRIPS principles, only trademarks acquired in good faith before November 2004 could therefore be allowed to coexist. And the same goes also for products and services that are not of the same type, not comparable, where there could be an exploitation, or there is an exploitation of the reputation. So if the mark, this hypothetical mark for class 3 goods would be submitted after the GI application, still it should be refused or annulled if there is an exploitation of reputation. So in conclusion, having now 4 GI schemes, a 5th one is to be added soon, schemes that are autonomous, coexisting and not always consistent, in particular with reference to the relation with trademarks. Not to mention that we have third country GIs protected by bilateral agreements and GIs protected under the Lisbon system. It is clear that the system is too complex, and ECTA and ECTA's GI committee has been advocating for a while now to simplify the system, which would surely enhance the efficiency and the visibility of the system. A single legal framework for EU unitary protection and enforcement with, of course, clear provisions on the relation between trademarks and GIs and a single database would ensure clarity and alignment with EU law and also with EU laws on GI protection and WTO law. And ECTA is in favor of entrusting the registration process, or at least its administration, and the single database to OHIM. And this was also recently supported by a draft report of the Legal Affairs Committee of the European Parliament. Thank you.